death affects everyone. That was my hope, I guess, is that when people watch the film and see these stories play out, and all the evidence that's there for that there's something after, it would kind of cause us to think about the time that we're living here and sort of the impact that we can have. And that shouldn't be like in a daunting way. It should be like in an inspirational way. It should just be inspire us to everything from the small things, giving someone a smile, opening a door, just being there for someone, being a listening ear for someone who's grieving, all of that kind of stuff. I think it gives this life so much more purpose.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. We are so glad you joined us today because we have a very special guest. And before we introduce him, we just want to give some context to just how privileged we feel right now to be sitting with him. So, I think more than a month ago, we came across this movie. I don't even remember how. I think it was in an interview or something, where someone mentioned there was a movie coming out about near-death experiences. And me and Alex, like, people might not know this, but we are huge fanatics about like looking into this and learning more about it ever since you read Imagine Heaven by John Burke,
Yeah.
recommended by our pastor. And secondhandly, I was absorbing what Alex was learning. So I was like blown away. And it just like stoked this fire within us to be like, oh my gosh, this is not our home. Like everything here is just temporary. And what is beyond? What is after death? And so we got these tickets. And then when we went to see the movie, we were so excited. And we left being like, we need to tell everyone about this movie because it's just like mind blowing. Like everything that it depicted about near death experiences, including John Burke, the author of the book that we had read. And so we are so honored because we have the director with us today, Stephen Gray, all the way from Canada. In the midst of the PR whirlwind, he is spending time with us today. So thank you so much for being with us, Stephen.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
Well, before we get started into the meat of the movie, we actually just want to ask about you and your personal journey of what led you to make this movie because we know you've had other kinds of film experiences. So can you just kind of walk us through your journey of what led you into this space, particularly around this topic?
Yeah, so I've been a filmmaker for about 15 years. And up here in Canada, most of my work has kind of been in the commercial space. So I've done everything from selling, RVs. There's a brand called Leisure Travel Vans, which is a big product in the US as well. And working with, pretty interesting brands like Pepsi and AOL and Disney, CFL, which is the Canadian Football League up here in Canada. Some fun projects. But in 2012, my brother-in-law was actually killed in a car wreck. He was 36 years old, and was here one moment and gone the next.
Mm,
And that really kind of challenged me and personally. So basically, like all my life, I've been going to church.
mhm,
I was raised in a Christian home and going to church all my life. But in 2012, if I'm being really honest, I kind of let go of the idea that there could be a God because I found it difficult to kind of reconcile this kind of chaos in my
mm,
life. The world was continuing on around me, but in our home, in our lives, in my family's life, it was just utter chaos. And we didn't have any answers, and so I just was like, how could there be a good, loving God and see such chaos here. And this family, like my wife's family, are the salt of the earth. Like they're the all
Mm.
of them are the kind that would give their shirts off their backs to anyone in need. And so I just anyway, it was really difficult for me to walk through that. But that's actually when I heard of stories of people who had clinically died
Yeah.
and had these experiences and came back. And that long story short, that's what brought me back to my faith as a Christian, but also what's kind of led me on the path of making this film after death.
mm. Can you talk a little bit specifically around what about it brought you back to faith? Like, what was the revelation or what was the perspective shift that when you started looking into these near death experiences helped you to come back again?
Yeah, um, so I had a few people that were recommending books, and I'm not a huge I'm not a huge reader, which is,
It's okay.
it's
It's
unfortunate.
okay.
Um, yeah, so I have to really be into something, if for me to cause me to read something. And so honestly, I at the beginning, I think I felt like, when people recommended that, hey, you should read these books. I was just kind of like, I mean, are people just kind of making this up? Is this just wishful thinking? And I wasn't sure what to make of it. But actually, I heard an audio recording. Someone gave me a CD. Basically it's just I had a bunch of people around me that were just like persistent. You gotta hear these stories. So they're finding different means of me being able to get into it. And one was the audio CD, and there was this guy, Dr. Richard Eby, who is a doctor who he's clearing out this attic in this home after someone had passed, and he basically slid out and fell out 2 stories, and landed on a cement sidewalk, and he split his head open. um,
Wow.
so there's this audio interview, and he's talking about how, like, basically his next conscious memory, and he's talking about, this, having a body, basically like a spirit body that's made of light, and he's entering heaven, and he's having a conversation with Jesus, and it's like, and he's describing this conversation as telepathic, and it's a heart to heart communication. All of this stuff, I'd never heard of this before. I mean, this was the craziest thing for me, but it was like, it was the way he was telling it. It was so sincere. I mean, the guy was like crying
Mm.
as he's relaying all this. And I'm like, what on earth is this doctor doing talking about this? Like, I've just never heard of this before. So that's what made me kind of go back to, okay, I mean, I'm hooked. And I read something like 30 books on near death experiences, and eventually John Burke's book,
Mm.
Imagine Heaven. And it was just, it's this chorus of people's stories, talking about their near death experience, painting this bigger picture that, God is real, that heaven is real, hell is real. Because it's just like these people don't seem to know each other. They have very different backgrounds, very different circumstances, how they died.
Mm.
Even in some cases, there was atheists who were transformed and into accepting that there is a God,
Mm.
because of their experience. And I was just like, I think I was really kind of compelled by someone's transformation coming back. Howard Storm is one of the stories in our film, and he's probably one of the biggest sort of like, switch around in his life. He was a university professor, decades into this kind of belief as an atheist. And he was so confident in that even when he took his last breath, he just knew for himself that would be it. Like, he would cease to exist.
Mm.
He was terrified of death, but he just knew for himself that there would be nothing. And so he was very surprised to learn that there was something. That he was very shocked, to basically feel great. And he thought he had finished surgery and there was a recovered or something like that. So he just wanted, but he's wondering why he's having kind of all these different senses, and he's has an almost 360-degree vision and all this crazy stuff. But eventually he sees his body,
Mm.
and that's kind of like, this wake up call that, I mean, that's me down here, and yet I'm up here, and I'm feeling alive. So what's going on here, right? And he has a hellish experience. He calls upon, Jesus in his experience, which is, a whole insane story. But we want people to watch the film to kind of see how that turns around. But after, he comes back, and he basically takes a 90% pay cut, loses his job because he can't stand being in that environment anymore, filled by, only, atheists. He didn't have any friends or family, that were believers. All of the, colleagues at work, all of them were atheists, and he just couldn't. That world didn't mean anything to him anymore, so he left it, and became a minister. And to this day, that's what he is. Like, and then it was so serious for him enough that, his family, his wife thought he was crazy, and his kids and his wife, left him and abandoned him. So, but for him, it was still serious enough that life, that what he experienced was more real than this life. Um, that he was compelled to still stay the course, and give his life to God
Mm.
in
Hmm.
service in church as a pastor, all those years. And it's just kind of like that many years on, I don't know, if you were a con artist or something like that, making this story up, maybe you can do it for a year or two. I don't know, right? I
Right.
don't know what the length would be, but my goodness, you give your whole life up,
Mm,
like all those years. It's just, why would you do that
right.
if that
Mm.
wasn't real? So that's what kind of convinced me.
Mm.
Wow. Wow. It sounds like there was a lot that, obviously, there was a lot that went into making this film, you reading books and interviewing people. I actually want to take a step back a little bit to ask you a
Sure.
question personally. I'm curious to know, what was your relationship with Jesus and faith like even before doing all this? And after making this film, what opened your eyes? Like, what resonated with you? What revelations did you have after making the film, or even during the film?
Sure. So, growing up, I mean, I accept. So, yeah, like I said, I grew up in church and was raised in a Christian home. But I remember I was 11 years old when I accepted Christ, and I was I was just so passionate. Like I was just so on fire for Christ and so secure in my faith. But I will say that I think I was pretty. Like I said, I don't read a lot of books. I was pretty, I would say, biblically illiterate. I probably read like 3 or 4 books of the Bible, and that's about it. In my younger years, and so I'm sure that that played a large part in sort of when I realized how shallow my faith was. Going through that kind of loss. And you know what? The other thing about that kind of loss was my mother-in-law. Well, both my father and my mother-in-law. My father-in-law passed a year and a half after, so that's why I bring
Wow.
up my mother-in-law. So
Wow.
they both didn't lose their faith. They were both just so they were just like, no, I know God, you're real, and our hope is that our son is there in heaven with you,
Mm.
and we just give that to you. And
Wow.
that's the right response. I had the wrong response, but to be honest with you, I was probably probably made me even more upset that it's like that they how can they be okay with
Right,
this,
right.
and
Yeah.
anyway, so yeah, it was a very short time for me, like probably like 2 months, but there was a period of time where, like I say, I kind of gave up on this idea that there could be a God. um, I just stopped praying.
Mm.
I just kind of stopped. I don't know. It's just like I can't. This doesn't make any sense.
Wow.
And it was actually so yeah. It was near the experience stories that for sure compelled me into this idea that there. I think there is a heaven. I think there is something after. But there was a few signs as well along the way. Like God, I mean, in His mercy, kind of gave me a couple of. It's like so many things happen eventually. You kind of go, okay, I mean, there can't be coincidence upon coincidence upon coincidence. Like at some point I have to recognize that there's some kind of divine orchestration going on here that I have to just acknowledge, and so I did. And yeah, and then that's when eventually I'd come across these near death experiences. So very shaky ground in my faith at the point before I had gone into these stories. But after reading the books, and then eventually even being able to reach out and call them and talk to some of these people, and hearing the sincerity in their voice, and not just their voices, but their family and
Mm.
those around them, how changed they are and how different they live their life.
Mm.
That was very compelling, and eventually kind of brought me back to my faith. And I read the Bible in a totally different way. I think there's a lot of things in the Bible that were probably difficult for me to understand before. A lot of spiritual stuff that it's interesting, but I didn't know what to make of it. And our church didn't always talk about it. I read that kind of stuff totally different now,
Mm.
in a way that I think there's a lot more context and color to what we're reading in the Bible about some of these mysterious spiritual things that have to do with Christianity.
Mm. Yeah, totally. I feel like as you're describing just your journey, and also thank you for being so transparent about, having doubts and losing your faith, because I feel like
Yeah.
that's something that when people go through, they're like, this is not normal. There's a lot of shame with it, but we totally feel like we've shared
Mm,
ourselves a couple episodes before this. We've shared our own doubts and when we've lost our faith too, but how God actually used those journeys to bring us back to an even stronger, more authentic faith rather than a blind faith.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
as you were just describing your journey, it reminded me of Lee Strobel from Case for Christ. He started out as an
Mm,
atheist, just trying to investigate, like, what is this Christianity thing? Like, he was pretty anti-Christian, if I remember. But as he was going and investigating more and hearing people's stories, doing research, he realized there's so much more evidence than he ever realized for Christ and his resurrection. And
yeah.
so that is so powerful that God used your whole journey, like even the losses and the pain, to kind of
Mhm.
not just bring you back to faith, but now bring so many other people like this experience of watching the movie and stoking their faith. So, first of all, just thank you for sharing that. But the second, I
Of
guess,
course.
second part, and this is a question for you, is as you were like making the film, I'm just so curious because those of us who've been like in ministry and like doing work that's like tied with faith, sometimes it can get like the lines are blurred with like work and faith and life. Like,
Yeah.
how was it for you to actually make the film? And like, I'm sure there were hard moments and difficult moments. Can you just talk a little bit about like, were there points when you're like, is this worth it? Like, should I keep going? Or were
Oh
you just
my
like, no,
goodness.
this is my purpose. I need to do it.
Yes.
Give us the behind the scenes of
Yeah.
the behind the
Right,
scenes.
right. The real.
There was many downs for sure along the way. There's sort of like these peaks and valleys along the making of something
Mhm.
as crazy as this was. A feature length film that's going into this many theaters and that many stories. And then it's kind of a genre bending film. It's a documentary technically, but there's a lot of sort of narrative recreations and whatnot.
Mhm.
It was a very ambitious project to kind of tackle. Our producers, Jens and Jason from Cypher Studios, I mean, they told me that many times along the way. I mean, this is going to be, very difficult. It's going to be, and they had been here before and done other films that have gone to theater. So I was so thankful to have them come along me along the journey and help kind of guide that. But they told me in the very beginning, this is going to be like the hardest thing you've ever done in your life.
Wow. What a great encouragement.
Yeah, and it was like, and there's going to be highs and lows, and you're going to get depressed, and but you're also going to be like
Mhm.
feel like it's the biggest accomplishment, and all that stuff. And so I felt it all.
Mm.
But I'll say there's probably I don't know what the percentage is. It's probably 70-80% of it was in the valley, to be honest with you. Um,
Wow.
so yeah, it was really difficult to make this film. And actually there's a side to it that I really kind of underestimated, was the spiritual side to it, the spiritual kind of impact
Mm.
um in making this film. So John Burke actually, I remember when I contacted him, I think it was in 2016, and we're talking about his book and what it was like when he put out his book. And he told me, um I think this is good to do, and I think it's worth it, but you just need to know what you're getting yourself signed up for.
Mhm.
And he told me I should have some prayer covering, because you're basically putting a target on your back spiritually,
Wow.
and you're entering into a world that's like pointing people towards the kingdom of
Right,
heaven.
right.
But obviously there's going to be opposition to
Mm.
that. And so in the spiritual realm, there's going to be just roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And I mean, I experienced it all. You have no idea
Mm.
the amount that kind of came against me, against my
Mm,
family,
wow.
against my kids. Yeah, it was a really difficult process, and then extended to even the team that was putting this together. So
Wow.
it was difficult. So on top of just making it a film, which already has its own difficulties, and then never mind an ambitious film, the spiritual side was just a whole other element. So
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I can only imagine. I feel like that actually has been coming up for me as well. Like, as I've been realizing, like, even last week, we were sharing with our friends, like, we felt just like this spiritual attack and oppression in a way that was just coming out of nowhere. Like, it's one thing to go through hardships because life is full of regular hardships, but it's another thing to be like, there are specific things happening all at once in every single direction, all related to certain themes. And you just know, like, that's not like, just a natural hardship. That's actually in the spiritual realm trying to stop
Yeah.
you from doing God's work. And so that totally makes so
Hmm.
much sense that you would go through that. And just again, thank you for sharing that, because I feel like so many people would like go see the movie, walk out and be like, "Oh, that was such a good movie," and never even think of all the blood, sweat, and tears that had to go into making it.
Yeah. I can only imagine. It's I've never created a film, but I see all the behind the scenes, and that itself is already hard. But before we transition into the actual film and NDEs or near death experiences, I wanted to. I should have asked this question in the very beginning, but I think it's still relevant. So I feel like many Christians really don't think about eternity or after death all that much. It's more
Yeah.
about how can I use what's in this Bible to apply to my life for now to comfort me, which is all good, right? My worries and the
Yeah.
challenges of life that I'm going through. But if you were to have a stranger come up to you and they were asking, why should I care about life after death as a Christian? What would you say to them?
Hmm. Well, death affects everyone. I mean, we're all gonna die,
Mm,
right? That's something that we can guarantee for every single person that's alive today.
mm,
Unless Christ returns, we're all gonna die. Um, so that's just a reality, and grief is also something that is going to affect everyone at some point. The typical order of events is you're going to lose parents, or you're going to lose people older than you, your grandparents, then eventually siblings, and eventually friends, and but you could be the first that goes. We don't know how much time we have here.
mm,
I learned personally that life is very fragile, and that and that we don't know how much time we have here. So I think that should put things in perspective. There's this saying where I remember hearing it in church where you could be too heavenly minded that you're no earthly good.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard that saying.
Yeah.
I think it's actually should be the other way around. I think it's actually that we're so earthly minded that we're no heavenly good. And I think
mm,
having our minds on heaven, having our minds on that future meeting God face to face, meeting Jesus face to face, which is what we all want.
mm,
In the end, this is like that's home for us.
mm,
Thinking about the kingdom of heaven and all of that it's an active thing, right? Heaven exists now today, and there's angels all around us. The Bible talks about that. There's all this spiritual side to it in terms of like the this reality of the spirit realm. It exists, and it's all throughout the Bible. I
mm,
mean, it's Old Testament, New Testament. It's the Bible has more on that than it does anything else.
right.
And I think if we sort of live with an eternal perspective, I think that will change the way we live here.
Mm,
And actually, that's kind of the goal with the film After Death. That was my hope, I guess, is that when people watch the film and see these stories play out, and all the evidence that's there for that there's something after, it would kind of cause us to think about the time that we're living here,
mm,
and sort of the impact that we can have. And that shouldn't be like in a daunting way. It should be like in an inspirational way.
mm,
It should just be inspire us to everything from the small things, giving someone a smile, opening a door,
Mm.
just being there for someone, being a listening ear for someone who's grieving, all of that kind of stuff. I think it gives this life so much more purpose.
mm. Yes, I totally agree. I feel like you kind of walk out with a new lens almost of like this life is not what I thought it was, especially what you said earlier about that quote about like I realized I was not a body, like I was a soul. That I remember even watching in the
Yeah.
trailer. That was like so powerful and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's so true." But we often think of ourselves as like just bodies, it's just what I see is
Yeah.
what it is. And so
Totally.
yeah, in terms of the like you talked about the goal is kind of for people to walk away, thinking about eternity, but I'm curious, is there something cuz when we watched the movie, I remember we both had revelations, but we also had questions. Like we left with some more questions than we came in with. So, one example is I we noticed that the movie didn't talk too much about, like the salvation aspect of like, oh, in order to see Jesus, like this is what you do. So I'm just really curious,
Yeah.
like when you were approaching the film, how are you thinking about people who will watch this, if they're Christian or not Christian? Like, what are people supposed to make of the near death experiences of, is this person, do you have to be like following Jesus in order to see Jesus, or can atheists even
Yeah.
see Jesus, those kinds of questions?
Yeah. Oh, I had all those questions, like, going into the film. So many questions. And there's a lot of these accounts that are very challenging to me. Even
Mhm.
like was challenging, I guess, when I first had kind of heard them, because I grew up with this like it. My the teaching in my church was, yeah, it's like, unless you're saved, like you've accepted Jesus into your heart, I mean, you're just not going to see Jesus, right? And so if you're an atheist, you die, like that's it, and you're never going to meet Jesus, and all that kind of. And but then the same thing for anyone with a different religion. um and so and I still believe that that's true. The thing about near death experiences are, it's kind of an in between state
Mm,
of dying. It's in the
Mm.
process of dying. I mean, that's something that we kind of unpack in the film.
mhm.
And obviously, as Christians, we want to be careful about, we're not trying to make some new revelation or new
Right.
Yeah.
whatever, like theology based off of this. In fact, you should go the opposite way.
Mm, mhm.
John Burke says in his film Imagine Heaven, you don't make like a new worldview or theology based off of exploring near death experiences. I think that's very dangerous, because these are all kind of spiritual experiences,
Mm,
and they could be varied, right?
right.
So, for that person, maybe there's some kind of revelation that was meant just for them to kind of get them back on course. But if they're sharing with everyone else, and you're taking that and being like, well, that applies to me, that's something for me. Howard Storm was given this, moment where he's seeing himself as he was an atheist, and he has this hellish experience, and in this place, what he would call hell, which is very different than my church's sort of, my upbringing in
Mm.
the Christian faith of what hell is. My view, my understanding of hell always is, it's a devil with a pitchfork, and you got demons around, and you're in a fiery pit, and there's flames, and that's the visual of hell. So it's very odd. I remember when hearing about these experiences, the hellish experience is more often described as, it's the absence of God,
Wow.
and I think before I that maybe wasn't unsettling enough, but when you really think about that for a moment, that's probably the most terrifying thing you could ever imagine. Because here on Earth,
Mm,
sorry, I'm going on a couple tangents here, but here on Earth, we see both good and bad. We see evil, we see good.
mm,
We see the atrocities of war, right? Like
right.
what humans are capable of doing to each other is just unbelievable. But that's just like the signs of that there's evil in the world. It does exist. But then there's also good. There's people that are out there day to day, unsung heroes, who are helping the homeless. Feeding the homeless. They're helping widows. There's people that are just doing like their hands and feet of Jesus day to day, and
Yeah.
and you'll never know their name.
Mm,
And that exists all around. That there is good. So there's both here on Earth, but in this place, what Howard might call the void is the inverse of light. So he would say it's not like being in a room with the lights off. It's not like a starless, moonless night. it's the inverse of darkness, so it's actually blacker than black.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
and it's only death, it's only chaos, it's only hopelessness. It's all of the things that are opposite to what God is.
Mm.
And in heaven, it's the opposite of that. In heaven, there's no death. In heaven, there's only joy and peace and love and unity. And the love experienced in heaven. I mean, so many people describe it's this overwhelming, unconditional love.
Mm.
And that was the other interesting thing too, is interviewing these people from different kind of backgrounds and have even sometimes different languages. They didn't have they're like, there's no words to describe that the love that I felt there doesn't exist in my language, in my native tongue. And then the same thing would be repeated like everywhere around the world. It's like that love is tangibly different. And the closest thing we got to kind of understanding it was funny enough, Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote the book Life After Life, it coined the term near-death experience. He kind of was one of the founding people that kind of unpacked this whole phenomenon of near-death experiences in North America. When he was traveling all around the world, he said that was something that was very common, was that this love is tangibly different than something we can experience here on Earth. And he says, in the Greek, it's like it's agape love is like the closest thing, which is what the Bible describes as that's the love of God. It's different than what love can be experienced here. There's always some sense of selfish motive behind love here, and then also in English it's so silly, like say, hey, I love these AirPods and I love my wife. Those are two very different things, right?
Right.
We only have one word that describes this whole spectrum of love, but even languages that do have that multitude, it's like this love is totally different. It's completely different. It's unconditional, overwhelming love, and that's emanating from Christ in heaven. And yeah, it's just tangibly different. So anyway, going on a bit of a tangent, but Howard talking about how in hell he's being ripped to shreds by these figures. I mean, we kind of paint them as a picture of potentially like demonic figures in the film. He's not sure what they were. He said he describes them as people like, but there was some things that were a little different. They had sharp teeth and they had claws, so unsure of form. But while that's happening, he's remembering himself as a small child, and he's brought to Sunday school, I think once or twice, on his street, and he's taught this simple song, "Jesus loves me, this I know," and that's all. That's it. And he's wondering why he's remembering this, but then he just feels like, why did I believe something like that? So simple. Um, and I've come so far from that. And then he heard this voice tell him to pray, and he had no words. He didn't know what prayer is. He's an atheist. He doesn't. That's not his vocabulary. He hasn't read the Bible. He doesn't. So he tries to come up with. He's told 3 different times. It's a persistent voice, and he starts to come up with words like, I don't know, God bless America, just kind of random things that are coming to memory. And as he starts to mention God, these creatures around him are getting louder, more aggressive, but physically distancing themselves from him. And like there was power in it. And then and all of a sudden, just kind of from the bottom of his gut, he calls upon Jesus to save him. And Jesus shows up in this place and pulls him out of it. And I just think to me, that just kind of points to the grace from God, that even in this place where he's on his way to final death, he's going to eventually come upon this place where there's this sort of threshold where he cannot come back. God's using every little thing possible to get his attention, including a memory of himself 1 or 2 times that he'd gone to a Sunday school program and heard about this Jesus. So that just made me think about, how important it is to share the gospel. It's
Yeah.
so important.
Yeah.
But to kind of get back to your original question, so when we approached this film, we kind of approached it as the question was always like, what is this film going to be and who is it for? death affects everyone. So this reality of life after it affects everyone. We wanted to have it be accessible for people who are of faith and people who are not of faith. And our hope is that this film kind of opens the door to people who haven't thought about any kind of spiritual reality before. And then those who are of faith, like myself as a Christian, it's hopefully it inspires us and motivates us and encourages and deepens our faith. Um, but really, it's kind of like the film shouldn't necessarily be something that hits you over the head or makes it like a bunch of Bible verses and stuff at the end. Our hope is that because through relationship, it should be people in the hands and feet of Christ that are leading those in conversation to Him. I think people have to make a decision at the end of the day, and the film just kind of makes cases that there is something after, and that this does happen all around the world. And when I was researching this stuff too, I found it really interesting that all around the world, people dying and having these near-death experiences. I haven't come across people who are describing seeing a different deity, one that they grew up in that religion. Let's say like meeting Muhammad. Um, there are some like online accounts, but when you start to dig through some of them, what I found interesting in some of that, for example, is in Syria and Iraq. We actually talked to there's a scientist out there in Iraq who was trying to publish some papers on near-death experiences, and he's not able to publish his papers unless it's filtered through the government. That's just the way their country works. So there's this filter that happens, which is directly connected to their religion. So the religion actually has to influence what the published papers are and the published reports are that go out. There's people that grew up, a Muslim and of that faith, and they're expecting to see Muhammad in their encounter after death, and they don't. They come across this man made of light and love, and they would identify him if they call him a name. It's Jesus.
Wow.
It's different than what they were expecting, and it's the same thing for Buddhists. It's the same thing for Hindus. If they meet a deity, it's Jesus.
Wow.
And that's all around the world. So, yeah. Sorry, I went on a few tangents there, but
That's okay. We're all about tangents ourselves.
Yeah.
These are Holy Spirit tangents, so it's good. But I'm glad you mentioned that because I feel like a lot of people do have that question, especially if they're exploring or non-religious. People are like, "Oh, why do Christians
Yeah.
all think they're right? Like, couldn't it all be the same God? Or couldn't, maybe Jesus is not the one true God?" And there's all these questions, but I definitely, I've
Right.
heard from even personal friends who've had really really vivid dreams to the point of it's almost like a near death experience where they were exploring faith and maybe exploring Buddhism or exploring Islam,
hmm
and then they were so surprised because the man they saw in their dreams was actually Jesus, and they're like, why
Yeah.
why is Jesus here when I'm like a Buddhist? And yeah, I feel
Yep.
like that's so amazing. So I'm so glad you talked about the nuances because I think there are still misconceptions around, oh, but there's reports of people seeing, Muhammad or Buddha or whatever, but there's definitely so many other contextual, societal, governmental influences that we also have to take into account. And not every report that we hear is also valid. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's it's difficult to kind of go down that road of like validating and invalidating experiences and that kind of
right.
stuff. I would say if you're looking at the data points, if you look at like over 4,000 accounts that are on Dr. Jeffrey Long's Near Death Experience Research Foundation, there's multiple different languages, people all around the world that are submitting their near death accounts, but also it goes through a rigorous, form, a survey, which is the typical kind of clinical study. The data points are overwhelmingly people pointing to Jesus. So I mean, if you just that's the raw data there. I mean, I'm not trying to muster up something that's confirmation bias for myself. And because again, like losing my faith, all those years ago, I really wanted to know, um, is there something after or not, and what is it? Right? If I'm wrong, let it be. Like I want to know really what what this is and what people are experiencing, and so I was trying to honestly ask that question and explore that, and it all points to God. Like that's just if you're
Mm,
seeking that, and I think people should seek that and ask those questions, investigate it. I mean, it's all going to point to God eventually.
Mm. Yeah. I think there's so many personal takeaways that people can all have. One that was definitely one of mine when or both of us, I think, when we were talking about the movie was God being so much more loving than we could even fathom. Like when the people were
Yeah,
describing in the movie like an ocean of love and just that unconditional love, I walked away being like, wow, I don't think I've really realized like how much God is love. And it just really challenged me
yeah,
and stretched me in that way.
yeah, I think it's just super encouraging to hear like science back, not science, but like evidence backed evidence, I guess. I don't know what the right word is. But yeah, I mean, one of my personal dreams is to actually see my both of my parents come to faith. They're definitely not Christian or anything like that. And
mm,
they're very one of my parents is very just hard Buddhist, like
okay,
hardcore Buddhist, and
yeah,
it's just super encouraging for me to hear those stories and testimonies that oh, Jesus is real, and I feel like
yeah.
I kind of want to go and spread the gospel even more. So I hope that this film actually does that too, because you're right. 100% of people die, and we don't know when
Yeah.
our time is up.
Right. What you were saying earlier too about these people making drastic changes for the rest of their lives after having these NDEs. It's like it reminds me of the disciples. Like, why would the disciples give up their entire lives if Jesus didn't raise from the dead? If Jesus was a fraud, like it wouldn't make any sense.
I know most of them go to their deaths, right?
Right.
Like that's the end result of,
Yes.
and they joyously do that.
Yeah.
Like they joyously like what that's the other thing too is there might be some people that are willing to go to their death for for something that they maybe are strongly convicted by, but like but to go with joy
Mm,
doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense,
right.
right? Like unless you had this revelation that Jesus is who he says he is, he's the son of God, and that there's the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
I think that's going to totally transform the way you live here on earth.
Totally. Yes. And I think it's really just so powerful to think of the revelation that comes with it because I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, but maybe it's just a vision or a dream." Like, is how do you know? Like,
Yeah.
versus when Jesus actually rose, that could be like reality. Like, that would be worth dying for. But I feel like what you're basically saying and what you're portraying through this film is the revelation that people get through the NDs was so real. It was reality, and it just
Yeah.
changed everything for them. So I feel like as the audience watching it, it's like we get a second hand of that revelation of like, oh my gosh, I need to change or I need to make sure I'm living for the right things and then in the right perspective.
One other thing I was just gonna this is more anecdotal and nothing, it's not in the film at all. It doesn't have to do with near experiences, but just kind of pointing to again greater spiritual reality and Jesus being who he says he is. There's a lot of people that are sort of that would do like new age or into new age and maybe even occultish practices that even in those worlds people will typically like sleep with a Bible under their pillow, or they'll use the name Jesus when nothing else works. Like Sage isn't working, whatever their dream captures are not working, to get away evil spirits. Because even in New Age and sort of cultish practices, there's that understanding that there is light and dark. They will all acknowledge that as well, and it's just this odd thing that that if they get themselves into an issue where they can't get rid of an evil spirit, they'll just use the name Jesus and it works. Um, but they use the name Jesus, as a tool uh, rather than have a relationship with Jesus, and that's all. That's all God wants. At the end of the day, He loves every single one of us, and He wants to call us to Him, so that we can have a relationship with Him. It's not to be used as a tool to get yourself out of trouble spiritually. Anyway, I just find it interesting that that's another thing again. It's all around the world that people, even in these other generally kind of spiritual people that don't have anything to do with religion, they'll still use the name Jesus, and that it actually works I always wonder, it's like, why don't you think about that for a second? If that's the only thing that seems to get you out of trouble in terms of, like, getting demons to leave, maybe you should think about that for a second. What power and authority does that name have? And maybe you should
Yeah.
get to know him.
Wow.
Stephen, we just want to say thank you so much for making this film, and we hope that it does bless and encourage those who both don't know Jesus and know Jesus as well. Um, Curious, one last personal question, and this one's kind of a deep one. Talking about near death experiences, um, by the end of your life, what would you want to ask Jesus, or what would you want Jesus to say to you?
I think before hearing these near experiences, I probably had lots of questions. Again, like, why did my best friend have to have his mom die when he was 13 years old? Why, why, my uncle, why did he die young? All these kind of, challenging questions. Um, but when I think about it, uh, I don't think I'll have I don't think I have anything to say. I think I will just be so thankful to be in the presence of, the God of all creation, standing before him. Um I'm sure I'll be speechless.
I think me
I'm sure
too.
we all would.
Just even thinking about it, I'd be just stunned.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Wow.
was just gonna. I'll give a couple of quick kind of sound bites in terms of if anyone's kind of listening or watching and just curious about the film After Death, and what it all has. So we have 14 different people that we interviewed who had clinically died between seconds to an hour and 45 minutes, as long as that we have in our film. But we also have neurologists and cardiologists. We have an oncologist and a bunch of different doctors that kind of have been exploring this kind of question, what happens after we die, for the last 40 years. And again, some of those people for the 14 that we include in the film come from very different backgrounds. So Steve King, he grew up in a Buddhist home in South Korea. And at the
Mhm.
time that when he was born and raised there, it's so insulated from Western culture. He said there was no, TVs in the living rooms of homes, and there was no movie theater at the end of the street. There was no Bibles that were accessible. There's no street preachers. That just wasn't a thing. And so when he had his near death experience, um, he was kind of touch and go for a while. His mom actually had called out to the Buddhist temple for help, and they said that they're taking a vow of silence, so there was going to be no help. But when he woke up in the operating room, there was actually a group of pastors that were around him, because that day there was a bunch of Christian ministers that all felt we need to go to this hospital at this time, and there's going to be someone there that we need to pray for. And so they just happened to be there at that time. And when he came to, after his mom was crying and so excited to see him, these ministers asked him, "Hey, you want to know, Jesus as your Lord and Savior?" He was so excited to accept Christ into his life, and because he was just, this is my second chance at life.
Mm.
I think he said the sinner's prayer 10 times in a row, just to be sure. um, but
Insurance.
this thing again, it's just, this is happening all around the world, and it's out definitely outside of North America, but it is happening across North America, and I
Mm.
think, if these things are happening everywhere, I think it should kind of cause us to think about it. But the film
Yes.
After Death is an hour and 42 minutes thereabouts, playing in theaters across Canada and the United States, and we hope people can go and watch it.
Amazing. Is it only in Canada and the United States, or are you guys thinking of expanding to other countries as well?
We hope to go international with it.
Okay.
That was going to be largely depending on how the film did in
Okay.
North America, and I think it's doing well enough to have that consideration. We're having some of those discussions
Amazing.
now about bringing it elsewhere, because yeah, it'd be great to play it around the world.
Yes. Do you know how long it's gonna be playing for? Because we know it might, I don't know, like, will people be able to make it on time to watch it?
Yeah, so kind of regardless of where it ends up, the URL for it's always going to be angel.com/afterdeath. So if people go there to that website, currently they can see, what theaters it's playing in and whatnot. But when it
Okay.
becomes available for streaming or purchase, that same URL will work.
Okay. Awesome. Yes, but regardless, and we're not being sponsored or paid to say this, so just FYI, we really recommend anyone who is listening to go see it ASAP because you don't know how long it's going to be in the theaters. And I personally think it is a theater. Like, that is just the best experience to watch it in, especially when you're seeing the imagery of like hell or
And
heaven
heaven.
and these experiences that just, I feel like on a smaller screen, it just wouldn't have the same impact, quite the same impact. Still good, but not the same. But yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. This was super just thought provoking. And I think a lot of people will be inspired to really think through the lens of eternity rather than just, our
Yeah.
materialistic or earthly viewpoints. So is there any last words that you want to leave people with before we close?
No, I want to encourage everyone just to kind of, think about this. There's books like you were mentioning kind of the beginning. One of the best books like I would recommend if you're interested in hearing about these things and want to know more in depth would be Imagine Heaven, John
Mhm.
Burke's book Imagine Heaven.
Yeah.
It does such a good job of outlining, cross culturally looking at 1,000 near death experiences and how that correlates to the Bible.
Mm.
Just really quickly too, John Burke's coming to faith was through near death experiences,
Mm.
and he wasn't convinced on yet on that Christianity was the way. So he went through and he was reading all the world's religions and all their ancient texts, and he was trying to see if what they're talking about in terms of the life to come is at all relevant to what people are describing in their near death experiences.
Mhm.
He would say there's about 40 kind of common descriptors of near death experiences. And in these other religious texts, there would be like 5 or 6 kind of common descriptors. But when he read the Bible for the first time, it was 38 out of the 40 common descriptors that were all throughout Scripture.
Wow.
And so for him, that was the convincing part. Was like, okay, I got you're real, and I think this is what I need to land on.
Wow. So
Wow.
the research is already done. If people want to just read the book, it's all there. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much again, Stephen. This was such a blessing. And yeah, again, if people have questions, please, connect. You can find all the links and learn more about the movie. We're going to link all the links in the show notes in the description. But yeah, again, watch this movie. It's so good and it'll definitely leave you with more questions, but questions worthy of exploring.
So thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. We really hope that it spoke to you and gave you some food for thought. Again, like what Stephen said, it's not an end all be all. It's also not to replace any biblical theology, but it's definitely just something to really stoke questions and get you curious and drive you even more towards the Bible and what Jesus actually says in scripture. That's definitely what has happened to me and Alex. We've just been even more on fire to really read, what does Jesus say about the kingdom? What does he actually say about living in this life for eternity and for the things that we can't even imagine for ourselves? And what does it mean that God is love? Like, all these questions, I feel like this movie does such a great job just provoking those thoughts and those questions. And it's really worth, if there's anything that's worth exploring, it's this topic of what comes after eternity or what comes after death and how do we live our lives for eternity. So yeah, if you haven't yet, the tickets are below, linked in the description, and you can also get free tickets if you can't afford them as well. I love that they have this pay it forward program where you can get free tickets. You can also get group tickets at a discount. So that'll all be linked below, as well as our link to our email newsletter. If you haven't joined yet, make sure you're on there because we're also going to send out resources, send out updates, as well as future podcast episodes on this topic as well. So we hope that it really blessed you, and we can't wait to see you again next week for another riveting conversation on how do we live our lives for eternity and fueled by faith.